So as I've said a couple times now, what I really want to talk about is this book, Jews in the Post-War World, and the Authoritarian Personality, because they're two halves of the same whole, two parts of the same project. But in order to do that, we've got to start out much earlier. And one historical problem is that, how far do you want to go back? Do you want to go back to the beginning of time? Do you want to go back to the French Revolution? Where are we going to start? There's just no good place. It always makes more sense and there's more explanation if you go back further. But the problem is your argument loses coherency because everything you bring up, everything that you get into is inevitably going to be shallow unless you give it an in-depth treatment. And if you give it an in-depth treatment, then you lose the subject that you actually want to talk about, and you just start digging through history forever. And if you're like me and you're naturally inquisitive about history, then you end up spending all of your time digging through loose ends and minor subjects rather than doing the thing that you started out trying to understand. So I'm going to make some introductory comments about ways to look at history. And then we're going to get into the background material for this stuff. You can think about explanations for world events as being, I would say, four different ways you can look at it. One, and the way that is most easily understandable by our degenerated late capitalist mindset, is the economic aspect. So things happen because money. Things happen because someone's going to make some money, lose some money, or keep the money they've already got. So if you think about one of the causes for World War I that you won't read in mainstream history books very often, but you will read in, like the second and third tier stuff that you've got to dig deeper for, but is often better than the mainstream sources that are written by court historians. One of the explanations for World War I is that the Imperial German economy was export-oriented, and that the German worker was highly productive, and he was his goods, the goods of the German capitalist and the German worker, were displacing British goods in the world economy. So the explanation here is that Britain wants to start a war with Germany, and they want to knock Germany down a peg so that the British economy isn't being interfered with by this German competition. There's a really good video about this on YouTube by Webster Tarpley, where he's discussing the Pearl Harbor attack. And I disagree with most of his conclusions there. I think he's totally wrong and it's quite ridiculous. But the historical stuff that he brings up to make his argument is very good. So I'd suggest you listen to that if you want to know further back about the interests of the Anglo ruling class and the American ruling class, and where they agreed and where they disagreed, because he's got a lot of good stuff there. But okay, so that's one type of historical explanation, is the economic one. Another one that we know very well, because this is what we grew up with if you listen to public figures and read other books by court historians, and what you maybe learned in school, is that there's an ideological component to history. So first off, it's the French Revolution and the American Revolution, democracy and republicanism fighting monarchy and social stratification. So the forces of leveling and equality and freedom versus the forces of tyranny, despotism, and privilege, we'll say. So that's sort of the second view, and we know this very well during the Cold War. The Cold War is supposed to have been a conflict between capitalism and freedom and communism and whatever you want to use to describe that, I don't know. In the same way, World War II is supposed to have been an ideological conflict between fascism and everyone who's not fascism, basically. Now, we know in reality that ideology is rarely a problem. You'll see very strange coalitions of people. And just to cite one recent example, in the Ukraine, currently, one of the parties that supports the Western-dominated ruling coalition is often described as a neo-Nazi party. And what they actually believe in and who they actually are, I don't know. But John McCain went and took pictures with these people. And so John McCain, being a representative of the American tradition, which, that's how he positioned himself and that's how he made his argument, shouldn't be anywhere near these people, because during World War II, the entire world fought, the greatest struggle for truth and justice in the history of the universe to defeat Nazism and its allies. So that just shouldn't happen. It does happen anyway. We could list, a million other examples. We could talk about Anthony Sutton's book, which we are going to talk about here in a few minutes anyway, to show that capitalism and communism have never been opponents enough for it to get between business. Meanwhile, German goods were being boycotted by Britain and America in World War I and World War II, even though Germany in World War I was an imperial bureaucratic monarchy, and in World War II it was a national socialist state. So the ideologies don't really seem to be playing a major role. Now, a third explanation is geopolitics. And we're not going to get into that. I'll give you my brief understanding of geopolitics. Let's say that you rank the top 10 most powerful countries in the world, and you create your metric for power by including factors like GDP, number of men in the military, number of airplanes, number of naval ships. So you mash all that together and you come up with one indicator called power. And then you rank all the states in the world from top to bottom. And let's say we're just looking at Europe right now. So in World War I, you've got Britain as the most powerful state. You've got Imperial Germany as number 2. You've got France as number 3, Russia as number 4, and probably Austro-Hungary as number 5. So according to this geopolitical explanation, the number 1 state, which is Great Britain, is going to have to ally with states 3 and 4 against number 2. And so this explains what happened in World War I. You get Britain allying with France and Russia to defeat Germany, who allies with Austro-Hungary. Now, of course, this obscures all cultural, religious, and linguistic components, but it's a general theory, so we're not going to include all that. This explanation works really well, I think, quite often better than the economic or the ideological explanations, because in World War I and World War II, you've basically got the same sides fighting each other. You've got Britain, France, and Russia fighting Germany and Austria, even though Russia switched from being an autocratic, bureaucratic monarchy to a communist dictatorship. Germany switched from being, a bureaucratic monarchy to a national socialist dictatorship. France politically was completely scrambled in the interwar period, so they really didn't know what they were trying to accomplish, and they were a fragmented society. But so the sides are basically still the same. The only thing that changed was that Italy went from being a semi-democratic monarchy to a fascist dictatorship. But even then, the only reason why Italy seems to have changed sides from the Allies to the German side was because they got ripped off during the Versailles Treaty. So the geopolitical explanation makes a lot of sense, much more so than the ideology, definitely. Now, the fourth and final explanation that I'm going to mention is, I don't know what you'd call it, the conspiracy theory explanation or the secret society explanation. And I think that this idea can't really stand on its own, or it gets too crazy. There are some people who say that World War I and World War II were engineered just to kill millions of Europeans and weaken European states. And the evidence that's put forward is that this happened. It killed all these people, seemingly meaningless. Everybody except for America was worse off, and you can include the actual American citizens were worse off after all of this stuff, but the ruling class was better off. But all of the major nations that fought in World War I and World War II were worse off after they started. So, cui bono? Who benefits? Well, certainly some industrialists and some people in the ruling class did benefit from all of this destruction. So the explanation that's offered is that there is a secret society or a group of secret societies or some kind of social technology like that engineers all of this stuff for its own benefit and to the public detriment. So I don't think that one can stand on its own, but it does reinforce very well some strange things that seem to go on, such as the assassins of the Archduke, the Austro-Hungarian Archduke, who that formed one of the kicking off points for World War I. Those people have ties to secret societies, so it's like an agent provocateur type thing. The Poles in World War II, some of the Poles the Polish leadership, supposedly nationalist but actually more Freemasonic, who were egging Hitler and his regime into making an attack on Poland. That seems to be the case. So anyhow, there's evidence of these types that seems to be very good supplementary material to some of these other explanations. So I've already run on for about 12 minutes here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pause this so that I don't lose what I've recorded already, and then I'm going to come back here in a minute and we're going to talk about some newspaper clippings from the 1930s. So you can go to a website that's hosted through the Library of Congress. It's called Chronicling America, and it's a very good resource. What it is a collection of scanned newspapers from America, from all 50 states, from the late, from the beginning of the country, basically, since the first newspapers up until, somewhere like the 70s and 80s. And it's obvious that this database has huge holes in it. For example, the New York Times does not appear in the database. And you would think that if you were going to scan old newspapers, then the paper of record for the country would be the first newspaper that you would scan in. But that hasn't been done. And I think the reason why it hasn't been done is because the New York Times wants to sell its online digital subscription, and the Library of Congress has just said, okay, we won't scan it in so that people will have to pay you. So it's this public-private partnership that pretty much defines American political, social, and economic life, in which the rich ruling class tells the government what to do and not the other way around. But be that as it may, there's some really good stuff in Chronicling America, and I suggest that you use it for your research because you're basically digging into the archives when you do this. What can you learn from it? So you can learn that certain things were reported in the press at certain times, that people said certain things or they thought certain things. You can't really use it to say that, this definitely happened because it was reported in the newspaper. It's fake news, has been around for a really long time. So it's more of like a sociological resource to say this is what the press was into at the time, this is what they were telling the public. So we're going to look at January the 3rd, 1932, from a newspaper called the Evening Star. This is the Sunday edition, called the Sunday Star, and this was the paper of record for Washington, D.C. It existed sometime maybe in the early 1830s, maybe 1840 or so, up until the late 1970s or early 80s, at which time it was bought by the CIA Washington Post. So the ending of the Evening Star is a whole saga in and of itself, right? But these early editions are really they're it's one of the most complete, important newspapers in chronicling America. So I suggest that you go check it out if you're going to look for anything in particular or just general news information, because people in Washington D.C. consumed a lot of news, obviously, right? Just for an example, the this particular paper, I think, was 100 pages for the Sunday edition. 100 pages, and it cost 5 cents, which is about $1 in today's money. So for $1, you get a 100-page newspaper. It's pretty amazing, and it shows you how awful, how horrible the media industry is today. Anyhow, we're going to talk about this article that I found when I was looking through it. It's called American Colony in the Heart of Siberia, and it's written by a woman named Ruth Kennel. Ruth Kennel was the private secretary to Theodore Dreiser, who was an American author, one of these people that you would never hear about today, and I doubt that anyone's reading them. But back in the 1920s and 30s, everybody knew who this was. It was like one of these best-selling authors. And like a lot of celebrities who are intellectually shallow, you can name your whatever celebrity you want to think about right now. Theodore Dreiser was enchanted by causes and political radicalism, even though I'm sure in his personal life he did nothing more radical than get drunk and sleep with other men's wives or something like that, right? So sexual impropriety and self-indulgence, typical of the celebrity artist class. But he also supported the Soviet Union, and he supported the Wobblies, the IWW. He was involved in some anti-lynching stuff. So again, just think about modern celebrities, about how the gentle giant Mike Brown gets shot in Ferguson, and then all the celebrities start tweeting. They don't know anything about black people. They don't know anything about Ferguson. They don't know anything about Mike Brown, but by God, they'll tweet about it. So this is who we're talking about here with Theodore Dreiser. He supported the Soviet Union, made several trips to the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 30s. He supported the Soviet Union all the way up to 1945. He said that Stalin was right with the Moscow show trials. So just a Stalinist, communist guy. And when you're like that, the Soviet Union cultivated a lot of intellectuals, American intellectuals. They would pay for them to come over. They would show them Potemkin villages, get them to write nice things about the Soviet Union. And so Ruth Kennel is the secretary of one of these guys, and she writes an article, very interesting to us, about the Kuznets or Kuznetstroy metalworking plant, metallurgical plant that was being built in Siberia. And I'll read you the subtitle here, or the underneath. It says, "Supervising construction of a huge industrial city, American workers lead a frontier life deluxe, bossing 15,000 Soviet shock troops and 30,000 exiled landowners who were forced to live in dugouts." What's a dugout? It's a hole you dig in the earth and then cover up with logs and pile dirt on top of it. So it's an earthen house dug into the ground. And as you know, once you dig far enough into the earth, you reach a stable temperature. So it's easier to heat and cool because you're pulling geothermal temperature regulation from the earth itself. So even though these dugout dwellings have some advantages, civilized people just don't want to live in them, right? They want to live in the kind of houses that you and I probably live in. So the reason that they're living in these dugouts is because the Soviet Union is dumping its money and its energy into metallurgical plants rather than housing. As you may or may not know, after the Bolshevik Revolution, after the end of the Russian Civil War, the Soviet, or formerly Russian but now Soviet society, was industrialized at the barrel of a gun. People were moved from their former rural dwellings where they were self-sufficient and created a surplus of grain that they then shipped to the cities to feed the cities, and then there was even more of a surplus, so it was shipped overseas. The Soviet project, the Bolshevik project, was technological and materialist, so all of these people were crammed into factories to try to move the Soviet Union into the 20th century. And so that's what this project is. These people are building a metal plant to do 20th century type of stuff, particularly rail lines, train lines, train infrastructure, even though they don't even have housing, right? They don't have wooden houses, but they're building a metal plant. That's the Soviet project. So I'm interested in this article, and I'm bringing it to your attention because we are talking about 50 to 100 Americans. You can see in this photo, they're here with their wives. They're being paid good money to set up and operate this metal plant, this metallurgical plant, to build infrastructure for the Soviet Union. And the labor includes anywhere from 10,000 to 30,000 slave laborers who are living in a concentration camp, right? And this is being reported in a mainstream newspaper, the most important newspaper in Washington, D.C. at this time. And there aren't really nobody's really got anything bad to say about this. This isn't really a problem. So we're going to read this last paragraph that I've got highlighted here. Perhaps the most depressing sight was the immigrant settlement across the river. There are said to be 30,000 exiled kulaks, as the independent, prosperous peasants are called. Well, they were independent and prosperous peasants, but no longer. Now they're slaves living in a concentration camp. And they're not living there because of their religious beliefs or their ethnic background. They're living there because they had more money than the other peasants. If you read about Russian economic history, the late imperial period, what the government was trying to do was to create a class of independent landowners and to increase efficiency. So what they did was they broke up old estates and they sold the land. This is after they liberated the serfs, right? They broke up old estates, the government bought it, they put the land on the market. And as you know, for human beings, there is a distribution of IQ, right? There's a distribution of intelligence and work ethic. And I'm sorry, but it's a fact. Some people work harder than others. This is what the libertarians and the capitalists and the free enterprise people always go on about, and they think it's going to solve everybody's problems, which it won't, but it is a real thing. So the government wanted to basically put the most land that they could into the hands of these small peasants who were going to use it the best. Now what happened is that some of these peasants were very successful, and then they bought even more land. And they became small landowners themselves, and they ended up producing disproportionate to their number in the population more goods. So, you give like 100 acres of land to one of these kulaks, they're going to produce twice as much as one of these other peasants simply because they're smarter and harder working. And that was basically, I think, what the late imperial government was trying to do. They said, if we get this land into the hands of the people who will use it the best, they'll produce the most stuff. We will sell this grain overseas. We will take the product of that, we'll take the foreign currency, and then we'll buy all of the stuff that we need to industrialize Russia. That was the late imperial plan. The Soviet plan, on the other hand, said we're going to put, as we see here, these 30,000 kulaks in a concentration camp in Siberia, and we're going to make them work menial labor, right? They're not going to have any control over anything. Their IQ and their hard workingness are just going to be completely wasted because they're not going to have any incentive to work hard here. They're just going to work as hard as they can in order to stay alive and not get punished even worse by the state. So they're going to do that, and then all of the former farmland was supposed to be industrialized and collectivized. So it's going to be all owned by the state 100%. Nobody's going to own any of it. And instead of having 400 peasants working on a place doing everything by hand through traditional methods, they're going to be using tractors, and there's going to be maybe 50 peasants. But then the problem, of course, was that the Soviet Union couldn't build tractors. They tried and failed. You can read about that in Anthony Sutton's book. It took them several years to try to build a tractor, and then the thing didn't work. So that was just a complete failure. And what did? They did what we're looking at in this article. They imported Henry Ford and his people to build tractor plants. So they eventually got their project working, not because of their own abilities, or their own plans, but through buying it in from overseas. I'm sorry for that discourse, that excursus, but we'll continue on here. 30,000 exiled kulaks in the colony, counting women and children. 10,000 working in Kuznetstroy on wages and rations like the rest. They have been recruited from Sibulon, the great prison nearby, a special concentration camp for kulaks. So who knows, maybe there's even more than 30,000 kulaks in this area. Maybe there's 200,000, who knows. A kulak is regarded as a class enemy, inherently opposed to collectivization, and the Russian poor and middle peasants believe that the only good kulak is either a dead kulak or an exiled kulak. And so, just briefly, another excursus here. I've had a bunch of these idiotic leftists show up on my channel and say that the kulaks all deserved to be killed by the Bolsheviks and that they deserve to be put into concentration camps or whatever. And they've got this strange idea that these kulaks were exploitators. But I don't see how a class of people who is of the same ethnic group as everybody else, so a Russian kulak living in a Russian society who's a small landowner, yeah, they're going to loan money. Are they going to loan it at exorbitant interest? Maybe, maybe not. They probably will do some loans. But it's really just, it's the psychological position of this gnawing worm thinking that anyone who's got more stuff than you and is doing better than you is doing it through exploitation. So it's a typical leftist mentality that any differences are unearned, any differences are wrong, and every difference needs to be flattened and leveled. That's where I think that's coming from, honestly. But anyhow, as to whether the Russian poor and middle peasants believed that the kulaks needed to be all destroyed, I kindly doubt that. The middle peasants were probably all aspiring kulaks themselves, so you don't hate the thing that you want to become. You might be a little envious of it, but you don't hate them. Whereas maybe the poor peasants did, I don't know. So the kulaks, are shipped in freight cars across the vast stretches to faraway Siberia, and then turned loose either with plots of ground to till or to work in industry, i.e. slave labor, right? After a probation period of 2 years, citizenship rights may be restored to them. And so that's probably something that was on paper, but what we do know about the Soviet Gulag system is that terms were often extended, sometimes indefinitely extended. So the fate of all of these kulaks would be a really interesting study to see what actually happened to these people over time, but I'm not sure anybody knows. Okay, what else have we got here? Just a couple of more things. This says the Frayne engineers are fine, sturdy lot of Americans. Building a metallurgical plant in the wilds of Siberia is no child's play. 150 workers have lost their lives. Those were probably all just Russians, I'm sure. the giant metallurgical plant, an important link in the Kuzbass-Ural combine, whose chief task will be to supply rails. So why am I bringing this to your attention? The point of this article is to show that the American press is reporting on a Russian concentration camp operated with slave labor. The Americans are there. They know what's going on. They're observing it firsthand. They're getting paid. And there's really not any condemnation here, because the cosmopolitan intellectual class, represented by Theodore Dreiser's secretary, Ruth Kennel, they support the Soviet Union and they're okay with all this. I'm going to pause this again and I'll be right back. All right, and now by comparison, we're going to look at two articles referring to or about camps in Germany about the same time. This newspaper is the Key West Citizen. The paper itself isn't so important. What you find on Chronicling America is a lot of small local papers, and just like today, but actually much less more so than today, local papers would have a staff of local journalists who would write editorials, opinion pieces, things about local news, all that. But then for their foreign policy stuff and national news, they would get reports from bigger papers. So what you're seeing here in the Key West Citizen is something from the Associated Press, from one of their correspondents who was posted in Berlin. So the paper, the fact that it's the Key West Citizen doesn't really matter. We're getting something from the Associated Press that would have showed up in papers all over the country. So we're going to look at two articles about the German concentration camps at this time. What did people know and what were they writing about them? Nazi imprisonment of 18,000 dissenters termed training to make fit citizens. Some 18,000 Germans from all walks of life are being held in the political concentration camps in various parts of the country. Wilhelm Frick, most of the 18,000 are socialists or communists, right? And then sanitary conditions, which would end up being the bane of these concentration camps towards the end of World War II, resulting in, maybe like 1 million people dying due to disease, starvation, and other things, which generally would be sanitary conditions. Sanitary conditions generally are described as excellent. So there you go for that. There's some description in here about what life is like for these camp members, and it's this is not really a critical article. They're just reporting on it. And you can see here they're doing calisthenics, they're doing military drill, and then there's a picture of this communist or socialist guy being forced to paint a swastika on a flag. Okay. Now we're going to look at a very different article about these camps. It's by a guy named Edgar Ansel Mowrer. Mowrer being a German name, M-A-U-R-E-R, which I think means mason, like a bricklayer. So Edgar's probably a second or third generation German American, right? And now he's writing about the Vaterland in a less than flattering way. This is also from the Evening Star, the Sunday edition, and it's September the 10th, 1933. So the first article that we looked at about the Russian concentration camp in Kuznetsk was January the 3rd. The other one we looked at was May, and this is September, so we're moving along in the year. Christian group faces torture in Nazi camps. Mowrer describes beatings reported inflicted on political prisoners. Estimates 50,000 confirmed. So he's reporting from London. I think he might have even been expelled by the Germans because all this guy did was write anti-Nazi, anti-Hitler articles, just over and over and over again. He was totally opposed journalist. Concentration camps for refractory Christians is the latest threat of Hitlerite Germany. The Germans themselves are not allowed to know this. They are not told that the leaders of the so-called German or Hitler Christians consider prison the proper place for those German Lutherans who cannot see their way clear to hoisting the swastika beside the cross. But Germans are not allowed to know much about what is going on in Germany. So, I mean, even there at the last sentence of the first paragraph, Germans are not allowed to know much about what is going on in Germany. You know, I mean, up to that, anyhow, you know what I'm saying. When, therefore, perfectly honest and simple Germans issue fiery protests against foreign atrocity fairy tales about their country, this issue was huge in 1930. It was absolutely huge. Foreign communists, socialists, and Jews were claiming that the SS, the SA, and the Hitler regime in general was going around torturing people. A lot of it is very difficult to believe because it will be statements like some Jew was collected and the SS pulled out every hair on his head one by one until he was bald. There was one story that I read about how the SS or the SA went into a rabbi's apartment. They shot him twice in the head, and then they rifled through his drawers and stole his money. But he didn't die. He was shot in the head twice, but he didn't die. And then they managed to put the rabbi on a train and wrap his head up and get him out of the country. So you just really don't know about these stories. One thing that was definitely going on is that there were a lot of street fights, a lot of battles between different groups affiliated with each of the different political parties. Like each one of the political parties in Germany had its own militia and street fighting unit, and they were gunning each other down in the street all the time. Particularly battles between, it's like the National Socialist guys would be fighting the communist groups, and then there were also even liberal and conservative groups, and they were all shooting each other constantly. But the way you hear about it in the press is that the National Socialists were going out and exterminating people. Hold on just a second. Okay, we're going to look at some more interesting things in this article. The title is, of course, as we saw, Christian Group Faces Torture in Nazi Camps. Mowrer is going to tell us down here who is typically who's making up the body of these prisoners. Pacifists, communists, socialists, Jews, Republicans, and occasionally Catholics and nationalists. So despite the title, which maybe he didn't write, he's admitting that people are not really being put in these German concentration camps due to their religious beliefs. They're being put in there for their political affiliations, and occasionally Catholics is the best we can do. So that's just, it doesn't really match up. He says fully half of the people in the camps are not what they're supposed to be. So, of course, you get denunciations, and then they round everybody up, and then they release some of them, and some of them don't get released ever. And some of the people, in fact, who were arrested in 1933 were in concentration camps until 1945. So they spent the entire 12 years in the camps. That is true. But that was a small number of people. And I think that was mostly the leaders of the Communist Party, like Ernst Thälmann, I think was one of those. Suicide often preferred. Okay, so now we're going to get into probably the biggest contradiction in this article. In the camps, the prisoners are divided into three classes. Okay, there's three classes of prisoners in the camps. There are the harmless people. That's one class. The second are the convertible, the ones that can be changed, they think. And the third class are the unconvertible. So the first class, the harmless, are treated reasonably well, is what the article says. The second class, the convertible, are sometimes beaten and tortured. The third class, the unconvertible, is made so unbearable that they sometimes prefer suicide. a procedure which Nazi guards generally encourage. So we don't know what the proportions of the people are who make up these three classes, but according to the article itself, the people who make up the harmless class are reasonably well treated. So everybody gets military drill, they get marched around, they have to work, they do have rest periods. It is strange because he says all prisoners are subject to constant insult, but then he also said that the harmless group is reasonably well treated. And you would think that constant insults and reasonably well treated don't really go together, but that's what it says. As an example of what happens to the people that they don't like in these camps, during the middle of the night, they're taken into a torture room, they're stripped naked, and they're beaten with 50 or 150 strokes of a baton or a wooden rod or something. Then a pail of water's thrown on them to wake them up, and then they beat them again until they fall unconscious. And then they bring a doctor in who gives them an injection of a heart tonic, whatever that is, I don't know, an injection of ephedra or caffeine or something like that. The sufferer revives again and can stand a few more strokes before sinking into a coma. Such scenes, often made perversely piquant by the addition of other indescribable details, form part of the concentration camp routine for unconvertibles. The high suicide rate among them, therefore, is justified because they're being tortured until they kill themselves. And then he says, or they occasionally go mad and assault an armed guard who is compelled to shoot them. And then he mentions Rudolf Mosse, who is the nephew of the famous Rudolf Mosse, who was the Jewish capitalist who started the Berliner Tageblatt, which was the #1 paper in Berlin and therefore Germany. So people like that, the nephews of rich Jewish capitalists who were media moguls, were ending up in these camps and ended up killing themselves. And then there was one other thing. Okay, so communists are encouraged to mistreat socialists. In one camp recently, they nearly murdered the former Reichstag president, Dr. Paul Löbe. So it's interesting that the article is talking about these conflicts within the camp itself. The communists are supposed to be, I would assume that they would be the least likely. They're the people who are going to be tortured, right? They're the unconvertible. But yet, even though they're being, beaten in the middle of the night to the point of death or whatever, they're still able to nearly murder one of their socialist opponents, and then that's the responsibility of the people who are running the camp. And then finally, tacked on there at the end to try to bring the title back to some sort of reasonable, some sort of connection here, it says, such is the life in store for recalcitrant Christians. So I think what you can really see from this article is that the communists, the socialists, and the Jews are being targeted by the Hitler regime. They're being put in camps. There's a bunch of stories about how they're being tortured, and there are some Christians in there, and the Christian stuff is being used as a red herring to try to drum up some outrage over this. The other thing I'd like to point out about this article is that it says that there are somewhere from 20 to 50,000 people in these camps by September it was? Yeah, by September 1933, they've got somewhere between 20 and 50,000 people in these concentration camps. And that covers the entire country. That's all of Germany. Well, we just saw from looking at that other article from January the 3rd by Ruth Kennel that just one Soviet industrial installation had 30,000 slave laborers just by itself. So, and of course, we don't know anything about torture and mistreatment, but with everybody living in dugout shelters and living, basically in a military lifestyle. And she said what? She said that the Russian middle and lower peasants think that the only good kulak is one who's dead or exiled, you have to kind of wonder how those kulaks were being treated, if that were true, or if that's the idea that the government is floating. So just put these two ideas together. In both cases, you've got what later today we would call, totalitarian regimes, for lack of a better word, even though at this point Hitler was elected with 33 to 43% of the vote, based on whichever election you want to consider. He did have a ruling coalition. You can get into a lot of arguments about whether the Enabling Act was legal or not, or whether the Reichstag fire was a false flag or not. But the truth was that in the election, Hitler got, anywhere between 12 to 17 million votes. There was never in the early history of the Bolshevik rule of Russia more than maybe 50,000 people who supported that group. They took power completely without popular support. Certainly most of the peasants didn't even know who the Bolsheviks were. So political legitimacy is two very different things. Comparing these two examples, the number of people who have been killed in Germany by the Hitler regime at this point may have been, a couple thousand, something like that. There's one book out there that I looked at that tried to document everything up to this point, which was September 1933, and they came up with 500. They came up with 500 people who had been murdered by the Hitler regime as of September 1933. And if you look at their list, a lot of them are, as I said, people who were killed in street battles. So if a communist got shot in the street, that was considered to be a murder by the regime. Whereas in Russia, there was a civil war in which God knows how many people were killed, starved, etc. The great debacle with Durante and the Holodomor and the famine in Ukraine is, I think, it's really close to this time. But you can go look into that and read about what the coverage was of those millions of people starving to death in the Soviet Union. Even separate from, who had to take responsibility for that, who was responsible for it and why it happened. Even separate from that, you can just look at the coverage. So my point in bringing these two articles to your attention is just to show that as we move forward in this historical assessment so that we can figure out what's going on in the post-war period, here in the interwar period, these are two examples of the way that or three examples, because we really looked at three articles. We looked at one that was sort of neutral on the German concentration camp issue. We looked at one that is totally anti-German, totally anti-National Socialist, and then a medium to positive outlook on the Soviet concentration camps that had not even, I don't think, one word of criticism, not even one word. Certainly no opposition to having 30,000 slave laborers in just one camp out of God knows how many. And then finally, just to add on to the end here, in the second volume of Anthony Sutton's Western Technological Transfer series, this is the entry on the plant that we looked at in that first article, the Kuznetsk plant, designed and built by the Frayne Engineering Corporation, which is exactly what Kennel said in her article. She said, so let's see, 70 U.S. engineers working under him. Most of the technology itself came from Switzerland and Germany, but the engineers themselves came from America. And of course, this plant, once it was built and set up by the Americans, was used as a model for future Soviet installations. So it's just one example that we came across. I'm not aware of this same kind of investment going on in Germany at the time, but can you imagine, for instance, if at Auschwitz or Dachau or one of these places there were 70 Americans and a multi-million-dollar industrial development project going on using the slave labor from Dachau or Auschwitz or anything like that, and then that being reported in the American press without criticism. So that's where we'll stop for now, and we'll move forward a few years in the next go around. Thanks for your time.